Okay, welcome everyone to Harnessing Emerging Technologies for Community-Based Conservation. And I'm not going to spend much time talking myself. I'm going to launch straight in and ask our speakers to present the work that they do, working with emerging technologies and communities. And we're going to start with Phoebe Ndiema from the Chepkitale Indigenous Peoples Development Project. Youssef, can you share your screen and start the presentation? And Phoebe, please proceed. The floor is yours. Please introduce yourself and then start.
Thank you so much, and welcome all to this session. As you heard, my name is Phoebe Ndiema. I come from Ogiek Indigenous Community from western part of Kenya. And today I'm going to talk about the case study of Ogiek people, how we've been using technology to do mapping in our community. And if you all seeing at the screen, there is a map, and that is basically a map showing the territory of Ogiek people. And why we did mapping is because of the numerous challenges that we were facing as a community. And it all began post-colonial period when Kenya was still being colonized. So at the lower side, the white, we call it the White Highlands, where people, my community, that is the Ogiek, were evicted. So, and the White Highlands were created by the colonialists. And then it didn't stop from at that. Later on, a forest reserve was created. And when the forest reserve was created, that means that the people were pushed towards the moorland, because this is it's typically a mountain. So, and as time goes by, the forest reserve and the national park was created, and you find that the community was only left to live in an area you are seeing where it has huts. It typically shows that there was infringement of their rights, and then evictions from their land. So that made us to come up with the need of how to get back our land. So the first thing we thought was to seek for justice through the judicial systems. And to do that, we needed to prove to the law courts that this is our land as Ogiek people. And that is where now we had to start mapping. And mapping began. We used different technologies, and the first one was, there was an application called Timbi, and Timbi didn't meet our needs as a community. It didn't give a clear view of what we wanted. And then the second method, technology that we used was GPS. And the GPS was basically to just map the ancestral boundary, which achieved that. And later on, there was now need of us mapping all the resources that are found in Mount Elgon, in Ogiek territory. And to do that, that is now when, in the year 2020, we started doing mapping using Mapeo. And Mapeo was basically helping us to capture all the resources in form of data in the community. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So, so here, to do the mapping, sorry. Yes, thank you. That is the slide. So to do the mapping, we had, first of all, to sit with the community, the affected community, were the Ogiek people. And the first stage for us, what we did was to do the sensitization meetings. And in these sensitization meetings, we had to walk village per village to ensure that every person was, we sought the consent of every community member. And from that, we selected the mappers, and the mappers typically came from the Ogiek community, so meaning they understood the land well. And also at that point, we also had the elders, who we call them the validation committee, because the aspect of mapping is not just about the technological aspect of it, but also we need the indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge from the elders. So that is what the spatial plan committee, or rather the validation committee here, means. And then during all this process, we were very sensitive to the gender aspect. Being an indigenous community, we wanted to ensure that also the women take part fully in mapping process. And then after finishing the sensitization stage, we proceeded to trainings, and the training was done by, it was co-done by an organization called Forest People Program and Digital Democracy, currently AWANA. And we were trained on how to use Mapeo application. And that way, we now, as secretariat from CIPDP, we went further and trained now the community members who are at the rural setup of Kenya, and that is where we live. My entire community lives. To do also this, we needed to ensure we develop a configuration. This is just a technological aspect of it, and the configuration had to have all the resources, or rather priorities of what we wanted to map, like rivers, the caves, and all that. And then now we started the actual mapping. So we did the mapping, and we collect the mappers collected over 5,000 points, and these points now were the ones to be manipulated. And the technology that was used here is GIS technology, and several maps were produced based on the needs. We wanted maps to serve as advocacy tools at courts. We wanted also maps to serve also as evidences during launching of historical land injustices that the community was subjected to. And that is when now the data that the raw data that was collected at the field was manipulated using GIS technology, and several maps were produced, which were basically more of outputs. So these outputs, which were maps, were then used at courts, because that is where we wanted now to use these tools. And I'm happy to report that we won a court case, and the maps played a key role in the same. And then also historical land injustices claims is an important aspect as in Kenya, and basically for indigenous communities who are subjected to injustice since colonial period. And we launched this, and the commission that was listening to this were happy to understand like every aspect and the story using the maps. Like the first map that I showed when I was starting the presentation, that is the map that guided all the process, and all of them are happy, and they say that it will make their work easy when they when they want to launch the compensation stages for the Ogiek people. Next slide, please. If you see the photo, you see, as I said, the Ogiek people were in conflict with the government, that is the Kenya Forest Service and the Kenya Wildlife Service. And as you see from the production of maps, maps gives a clear reflection of how resources are being used. And as you can see, this is the director of CIPDP showing to different stakeholders from the government how we can how they are responsible for destruction of part of the forest, and how we can conjointly put efforts to ensure that we conserve Mount Elgon forest together. So in a nutshell, I can say that maps speaks a lot, and it is a voice in its own. Yeah, next slide, please. So from that, seeing the fact that we achieved a lot in court case, we won a case using maps, and also it helped us to launch our historical injustices. Now, because we are dealing with the scientists, like you look at the scientific perspective, and we are indigenous community, we have the traditional knowledge, but to be able to demonstrate that we can conserve biodiversity in Mount Elgon, we needed now to try and merge this, integrate this into a modern way that the scientists understand. And that is why we are integrating this by developing a community-based biodiversity monitoring system. And then the methods we are using is we're using the camera traps, we have the line transect and the quadrats, and all these are integrated back into the Mapeo, because Mapeo, we've tested Mapeo at the doing mapping, and we produced maps and it served the needs of the community. That is now we are using Mapeo as a tool now to do the biodiversity monitoring. And the long-term goal of this is to show the world the stewardship of Ogiek people and other indigenous communities in conservation, in conserving the nature. And also through this biodiversity monitoring, we are going to store data of data that concerns the use of indigenous knowledge, such as the community bylaws, and also the self-governing structures that are developed by the communities in ensuring that we conserve biodiversity in the world. Yeah. So basically, that is how practically we are using mapping and how we are using technology to ensure that we conserve Mount Elgon forest. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. That was a really fascinating account. Really great to hear. And I think that we'll move straight on to Alia. So Alia, if you don't mind, we'll gather questions, by the way. Everyone can write questions into the chat. Please feel free to write questions into the chat or to hold on to questions to ask them directly afterwards. But we'll have the speakers speak one after the other now. So this is Alia. Welcome. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Okay. Share my presentation. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Alia. I work with Awana Digital, which was previously and still mainly known as Digital Democracy. We developed the Mapeo app, the one that Phoebe was talking about. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that tool, but also really about like why we developed it and what the needs and the kind of issues are that we were trying to respond to when we developed it. So Awana Digital supports Indigenous communities to develop tech-based strategies for land defense. And what that really means to us is that we're working alongside communities such as Phoebe's community, the Ogiek, co-designing technology, and also working with them to try and find the best solutions for them, which might or might not be the tools that we're developing. There might be a whole range of other tools. And then we're trying to sort of share those learnings and that knowledge with other communities so that they can understand the best practice and apply those learnings. So these are the three ways of working. So we have the direct support that I mentioned with some communities, the co-creation of tools, and then the sharing of learnings. And our idea really is that the tools that we develop hopefully will be easy enough, and our methodologies and approaches kind of explained well enough with online guides and tutorials and things like that, that they can be really widely applied and people can pick them up, community members can pick them up without having to depend on us always to do the teaching. So I want to go back 20 plus years when I first began working in this field. And really technology has changed so much in that time. When I first started working with communities, which was in Peru in the early 2000s, you know, mobile phones had only just come about. There was no phone signal outside of most cities, sorry. Nobody had internet connections. There were barely websites existing. So if communities wanted to use maps for land defense, which is how the organization I was working with was supporting them, the most people could be involved in was kind of data collection. So they might draw paper maps, sort of get involved in drawing paper maps in the community, and then possibly using a GPS to go out and take some data points. But then pretty much all of the data entry and all of the kind of creation of the map product and all of that bit of the work had to be done outside of the communities, because there was no, most communities that I was working in the Amazon didn't have electricity either. And the technologies that we were using were very complex. So we were using ArcGIS, which is an amazing, sophisticated tool, but really beyond the capacity of most of the community members that we were working with. Like, it takes quite a lot of learning to understand it. So there was a lot of data extraction going on, and I was very aware of that at the time, and I didn't like it, but it felt like, you know, the best way to do things at the time to get the communities the tools that they needed to support their land. However, fast forward, you know, 10 plus years from then, smartphones came along, a lot of apps suddenly appeared that enabled people to collect data, to look at data. ODK is one good example, and there were other sort of GIS-based applications as well. But what we found when we started working or carried on working with communities, and when I started with digital democracy, was that most of those tools still relied on this sort of extractivist model, because most communities still didn't have access to the internet or mobile phone signal. If they did, it wasn't a fast enough connection. Most people, or many people, weren't in tech literate enough to use the complex programs that were required to kind of look at the data once it had been collected. So that a lot of the same things were going on as they had been 10 years ago. And that's why we really started to try and tackle this issue by building a new tool, which we called Mapeo. So Mapeo is a free digital tool set for documenting, monitoring, and mapping all kinds of different data. And we built it with these sort of central tenets: that it work offline. So as I said, across the Amazon at that time, there was pretty much no internet connection. And if there was, it was maybe you had to travel for 3 days, and then people in the community would still lose access to the data because it was only people who were able to travel who would be able to kind of connect online and send the data where it needed to be. It's free and open source, so lots of the tools, there are lots of free tools. Some of them are proprietary and sort of incur ongoing payments. We wanted it to be intuitive and easy to use, as easy to use as possible, so that people in communities, you know, there are many non-literate members in communities, often elder members of the communities, and we wanted to make sure that they could still feel involved in work that was being carried out by their community and understand as much as possible, even if they couldn't read the words or they weren't used to handling smartphones or computers. We wanted it to be as customizable as possible, so be able to change the languages, communities be able to draw their own icons and upload their own sort of questions and categories to it. Data sovereignty was a really big issue for us, so we wanted to make sure that all of the data stayed in the hands of whoever was collecting it, whoever really owned it. And they could then decide if they wanted to share it. Maybe they did want to send it online, maybe they did want to share it with the government or with media or with law enforcement, but that should be their decision. It shouldn't be part of the sort of data collection and analysis process that it had to be sent to a server, or it had to go online, or it had to leave their hands. And finally, we wanted it to support collaborative workflows, because it's obviously key in community processes. Here are just a little examples of what some of the screens in Mapeo looks like. So on the left, we've got 2 different screens showing what we call the configurations, and these are the kind of different categories under which you collect information. So one of these is actually a Maasai configuration, and the other one is one in Spanish, a sort of general mapping and monitoring of illegal impacts. So for example, if you wanted to collect data on illegal mining, you would go out with the smartphone, and you would, if you find a site of illegal mining, you could tap the icon. There's an icon there on the left about illegal gold mining. You would tap that. You could then take photos of what was going on. You could write a little note about it, and it would store it with the GPS data. And then the photos on the right show a couple of different examples of offline maps that can be put into Mapeo. And these ones were created specifically for the communities with the information which they needed to make sense of things on the ground when they were out collecting data. So Mapeo is being used for different purposes: for recognizing land rights, collecting mapping data for legal cases, for land management and internal governance, for biodiversity monitoring, as Phoebe has mentioned, and hopefully reducing illegal activities, so monitoring and collecting data about illegalities and getting them acted upon. I'm going to just mention a few quick case studies of how it's being used. So the Guarani in Ecuador used Mapeo about 6 or 7 years ago now. They did a big mapping project over 500,000 hectares of land. And as part of that process, they actually co-developed the tool, because it was sort of built alongside them at the time. And then they used the maps which they produced to get some oil concessions removed, which the government had created illegally without consulting them. So there was a big case in Ecuador, and they were able to get those concessions removed. As Phoebe mentioned, these are some images from the Okiak mapping work on Mount Elgon, and they used it for land rights, for internal governance, and now for biodiversity monitoring. Here's an image of it being used in Peru. This is to monitor illegal gold mining, and the communities there are using it alongside state authorities. So there's a community patrol team that goes out, and if they find evidence, they'll collect it, and then returning to the office, they'll synthesize a report, which they send to the park authorities, and they can then go in and take action on what's been found. It's been used in Suriname, with the Wayana using it in a huge mapping project of 2.5 million hectares of land for a land rights case. They haven't had any land rights recognized as yet, so they're trying to build that case. So there's some quick examples of Mapeo use, and very quickly before I finish, I wanted to mention the Earth Defenders Toolkit. So although as an organization, there are some tools that we're working on and championing, particularly like Mapeo, we're also trying to gather together information and methodologies and other tools which might be useful to communities so that people can really decide what the best tools are. So the Earth Defenders Toolkit is a website, the platform, which actually Rudo was one of the principal creators of a couple of years ago. And it has some guides on it. So here are guides. There's a guide about creating community networks, a guide for doing mapping work, monitoring work, digital security, all kinds of different guides. There's case studies about how some of the partners that we work closely with, how they're using different tools as part of their land defense processes. And it also has this database with a whole lot of different tools that might be useful to communities, including ones designed with and by Indigenous peoples, such as Mapeo, such as Terra Stories, which is a tool for collecting oral histories, How, which is a tool for collecting Indigenous genealogies, and a whole lot of other tools as well for GIS and other data collection. And you sort of put in your preference, like I want a free tool, I want a tool for mapping, I want a tool on a smartphone, and then it sort of filters it out and gives you the options, and then you can sort of look through them, read through them, and decide which ones you might want to investigate further. So the Earth Defenders Toolkit really is a place for people to kind of research tools that might be useful to them, and it includes free and also proprietary tools like ArcGIS, because in some cases those are the best tools for communities to use. And a few final words of wisdom or learnings that I've had along the way. I think the right tech isn't always the newest and the shiniest. We can be very drawn to the drones and the camera traps and the latest GIS, but sometimes drawing a paper map with everyone around it is the best way to get conversations going. And often it's the conversations which are the richest part of the work. So similarly, the most important outcomes aren't always the map products or the data. Those can be super useful. You might need evidence to produce in court to show that something's going on. But often the community just coming together, talking about issues relating to land and growing common understandings, common language and solidarity, that can lead to the real breakthroughs. And the cases that we've worked on, the Warani, for example, that case won because all of the community had come together over a period of 3 or 4 years doing the mapping work, so that when the legal case came along, they were all involved and they all knew what to do. And then some final sort of pitfalls or things to consider. So first and foremost, keep yourself safe. Environmental land defenders are unfortunately often targeted, and the sort of cases of violence and attacks and killings are going up. So, make sure you're safe, create protocols if you think your teams or your data might be targeted. Consider buying tech in country. This is a little thing, just because often NGOs, including us, will bring in the best tech from the UK or the US, which might work brilliantly until it breaks, but then it can't be fixed in country because you can't get the parts. So consider whether actually buying tech in country might work better. Review data that's been collected as quickly as possible to make sure that it's complete and verified with the community before you kind of forget what's going on. Set up good backup and referencing systems. This is so important. So much data is lost because you know, a year later or even a few months later, people sort of forget where it is or how it's connected to the videos that they collected, or, you know, things just aren't connected properly or aren't backed up. So if you want it to be useful in 5 years and 10 years for your children and grandchildren, back it up properly and involve everyone. So like Phoebe mentioned, their project really centered gender and women in the project, and it was incredibly enriched because of that. And tech can support intergenerational learning and intergender learning, but it can also exclude it if this isn't kind of held centrally. So I just wanted to mention that as something to keep in mind. And that's the end. Thank you.
Alia, thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation. Really great. And we'll move on to people. Remember to write your chats in, your questions into the chat. Rudo, go forth.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, first, would love to say it's a pleasure to be following two amazing colleagues and friends whose work inspires me every day. And I'm really glad to be here having this conversation with them. So my name is Rudo Kemper. For the past 10 years, I've had experience working with and accompanying Indigenous communities to use digital technologies and rights. I'm currently with Conservation Metrics, and I was formerly with Awana Digital, the organization that Alia is a part of. So I wanted to share, I would like to start by telling you a story about one of my first engagements with digital technology, and I actually kind of stole Alia's template here of talking about how technology has changed so much, in my case, over the past 10 years. I'd like to tell you a story about how I got started doing digital technology and how I discovered a lot of the things that Alia mentioned in her presentation about some of the pitfalls and some of the reasons why we are building the kinds of tools that we are doing. So I think you'll see a lot of parallels actually with what Alia talked about in terms of her journey with technology. So I've been thinking a lot about this photo. It was taken about 10 years ago with the Wayana community in Suriname, where I was at the time working in Suriname and doing a training about the use of some of the kind of emerging smartphone tools that were coming onto the market at the time. So basically at the time, this community was using GPS to demarcate different points of interest, like traditional knowledge sites, sacred sites, but also doing boundary demarcation in advance of what Alia mentioned is currently kind of an ongoing discussion about land rights. And so they were using handheld GPSs at the time and kind of writing down manually the coordinates of each of the different points that they were taking, and also a short description on a piece of paper. And as you can imagine, that was a very kind of error-prone process where, you know, you had to manually write down coordinates. You might forget one by accident. It's also very difficult in the sun to be writing things down like that. You don't have a lot of room for information. And it's just a lot of work to digitize as well, right? So there was a lot of kind of manual work involved in this. So at the time, I was with an organization that was really excited about introducing kind of new technologies to streamline this process, right? And so ODK, which is still on the market and has made a lot of improvements since this time, I think, was one of the tools that was sort of available to us. And so we decided to, at the time, kind of create these custom forms in the indigenous language, Wayana, for them to be able to better collect data and to streamline that whole process, right? That went pretty well as far as the kind of implementation for data collection with community members, where they really enjoyed using it. It was a lot better, obviously, than the GPS kind of approach of writing things down on paper. So in terms of the implementation and the usage, that was really kind of welcomed by the community, and they enjoyed working with it, and they collected a whole bunch of data at first. And then we encountered some issues where, you know, a lot of, as Alia mentioned, right, a lot of this data had to be sent to a centralized server on the internet somewhere, which meant that the data actually had to physically leave the community, which meant that internet was required to be able to submit it to a place where it could be stored. And which also meant that people, you know, like ourselves as kind of geographers and technologists had to be involved in exporting that data and processing it and turning it into maps and bringing it back to the community. And it basically seeded a lot of dependency, right, on people that are outside of the community. And so what that meant in practice is that sometimes the community would not have access to their data for months because it would need to be sent. Sometimes the internet was lacking. They would have to send phones to the city to be able to submit it to the centralized server. And also the centralized server at the time, and this is me as kind of a naive young technologist trying my best to do kind of set up systems for them, was actually installed on a computer that was in my closet at the time. So it was actually the data was being sent to outside of Washington, D.C., where I reside, instead of being stored within the community's own hands or in a site that they're aware that their data is being stored, right? So to be quite honest, this taught me a lot of lessons of what not to do, because the community ended up being frequently disappointed by the fact that they didn't have access to their data. And it just seemed to be not the most resilient system if we value things like autonomy and sovereignty over data and many of the things that Alia mentioned, right? So I kind of walked away from that experience with a lot of lessons learned and sort of embarked on a journey of becoming more of a technologist and working with tools like Mapeo, which Alia's organization developed. And this is actually a photo when I was in Mount Elgon, working with Phoebe's community when I was briefly at Wana Digital, where we were working to introduce Mapeo as part of the mapping project, that CIPDP has managed to implement there. So I became much more interested in this kind of level of technology that's really built and predicated on values like data sovereignty and ensuring that the community has full control over their data at all times to avoid the kind of pitfalls that I mentioned. So actually the same photo that Alia shared, I think, when I had the pleasure of working with the community in, I think, 2022, when we were able to do some field work there. In the process, I also started to work more on open source tools, similar to Mapeo and really kind of inspired by Mapeo, a lot of the same values of creating software for communities where they have control over their data and the ability to share and decide who has access and who should not have access. So I think Ali also mentioned the tool Terra Stories, which we've been working on since 2018 as a tool for mapping oral histories, which is still an ongoing kind of active development project. But there's something that I still struggle with, which is that across all of these tools and most other data collection tools, there's a common pain point, which is that the data tends to be siloed in specific tools or file formats or databases or local devices. And communities still often need this kind of external support to have access to it, to make it useful, to store it in the very long term. And that still results in a lack of autonomy, right? When it comes to the management of one's own data, there's still a lot of kind of NGO ally or researcher or external support that's required for the long-term kind of maintenance of the data and making it immediately useful to communities. And that spans across a whole range of tools. So one of the things I'm working on right now is a tool called Guardian Connector. I mentioned earlier with Conservation Metrics, and we have currently a consortium of different partners sponsored by Niatero. Wana Digital Democracy is also part of this, and another organization in Brazil called Terras, where we're creating a new kind of data sovereignty platform, which is really responding to a lot of the things that I'm mentioning and hoping to at least find a way to solve them so that communities have access to their data. So a lot of the same design principles, honestly, as Wana Digital, where we're looking at data sovereignty. It's very important for everything that we're building to be co-designed with communities. We're building free and open source software. There's this question of kind of autonomy and accessibility, which means not only sort of always having access to your data in terms of storage, but also in terms of design, right? Being able to manage it. We're looking at sort of data source agnosticism. So finding a way to centralize data from many different tools. It could be Mapeo, it could be ODK, it could be your own kind of legacy data that came from somewhere else. And finding a way to integrate all of that into one centralized place where you have access. And just lastly, durability. So something that can last in the very long term so that communities will have access to their data now and into perpetuity. So we're trying to find it. This is a new product. We are now working with 4 or 5 different community partners to co-create this. So we're still early on in the journey. And we're trying to find different ways of visualizing this. And this is one current attempt. I think we can do better. But essentially, the idea here is that going from left to right is that you have all of these different data collection tools, or like I said, it could be other sources of data. And we're trying to find a way to integrate with all of those tools and store them in one centralized place and make that as painless and automatic as possible. And then moving towards the right, also introducing ways to visualize that data so that you can immediately have access. Once it's been collected and stored, you can immediately visualize it in different kinds of ways, including maps, including image galleries, and including maybe even some charts and graphs to be able to make sense of the data. So really one of the things we're looking at is compatibility. We're hoping to build something that can integrate with any and all tools that are collecting data or storing data somehow. And that also means now and into the future. So building it in such a way that even if there's a tool that doesn't exist now, perhaps in 20 years, that it can be easy enough to integrate data from that tool so that we're really building something that's resilient for the very long term. So two of the things that we're working on as of this moment, a lot of it is kind of back-end work just to make sure that we can get data from all those different places. But we do have some front-end work. So we have a dashboard that we're working on, and I'll actually show you a community example, which I have permission to share in just a moment. And one other thing that we're working on is actually a change detection workflow. This is sort of one of our projects this year that has less to do with kind of the data storage, but a specific need that communities often have, which is about getting access to data about their land from satellite imagery, right? So near real-time data about changes that are occurring that are perhaps due to extractivism, like gold mining or logging. The data is out there, but the problem is often that communities that are remote or entirely offline don't have access to that data, right? So we're working currently on a flow where we can kind of get those alerts from satellite imagery and automatically derive them and then share them actually with Mateo Mobile. So we're working with the Awana Digital team to build out a workflow where those alerts can be synchronized with a Mateo Mobile device, and that can then synchronize with other Mateo Mobile devices, even when they're completely offline. So that communities that are in the middle of the rainforest in the Amazon that don't have internet access will still be able to have the alerts going to them and can have a sense of what's happening in their land in terms of, the threats that are happening. So yeah, just sharing a quick example. So again, the Wayana community, they're one of our close kind of co-creation partners. And that's why I started with that photo, because for me, it was kind of a full circle moment of now working with the Wayana again, after 10 years ago, having this experience trying to introduce ODK and finding all of these kind of deficiencies. So they are using this tool to centralize all of their data that they're collecting. So that includes the Mateo data that Alia mentioned that they've been using to basically make a case for demarcation. So on this map, you can actually see the boundary that they have demarcated using their Mateo data. And then there's a map view where they can explore all of the data that's been collected with Mateo and now centralized in the system that's tentatively called Guardian Connector. There's also a gallery view, so being able to visualize all of the kind of images and photos that have been captured using Mateo and filter through them, and being able to view it in this kind of way. And they've also done a lot of survey collection using, in this case, Global Toolbox. It's blurred here because I don't have permission to share that because it's sensitive data. But essentially, they have collected a whole bunch of demographic information as well as some specific needs that they're interested in as far as baseline data for territorial management using Global Toolbox. So basically, the way that this works is as soon as Mateo data or Global Toolbox data is collected, can be automatically synchronized with Guardian Connector. And so near instantaneously, you will be able to see the results and have access to it and make sense of the data as it comes in, rather than needing to wait, as I mentioned, weeks or months for somebody to manually export that data from a platform to be able to visualize it in this kind of way. Terra Stories is also a part of it. This hasn't happened yet, but we want to make sure that all of the community data sits in the same place and doesn't, as I mentioned, get siloed into specific systems. So they are an active user of Terra Stories. They actually have a beautiful map, which I can share the link later, where they have publicly shared some of their stories, which are oral histories about their land or about kind of historical sites and so on. There's a selection of that they have shared publicly. And they're also interested in camera traps and biodiversity. So this hasn't happened yet, but we're working with them on a flow where they can get their camera trap data into the same system and then visualize it in different ways that we are currently exploring with partners. In terms of change detection, this is what that looks like. So they are in a territory that is as of yet not demarcated. So there's concessions that have been given out by the government to do gold mining in their territory. So this is a major kind of threat to their lands and also for their health, because there's mercury that's used in that gold mining process, which flows downstream to where the villages are. So they're very interested in monitoring where that gold mining is expanding. So we're using remote sensing data here in a different view as part of their dashboard, where they can have access days or weeks after the imagery is available to be able to explore where that mining is happening. And the integration with Mateo is actually really exciting. And we're in the process of developing this now, where once people collect data that is demarcated as a threat in their configuration, per what Alia mentioned before, that is then something that can show up on this dashboard. So you can see here, this is actually some of their real Mateo data that they've collected while they were on a river expedition, where they saw the entrance to a mining site, and you can kind of on the screen trace the road. There's a yellow point, which is the Mateo point that's selected, and then there's a road that leads to this pretty sizey mining site. And so this is a way then of visualizing field data together with the remote sensing data in the same place. And one of the things we're working on now is kind of export format. So how do we put this into the hands of communities for it to have power? So we're looking at maps, but we're also looking at templates where some of these things like the points, the Mapeo data, or the remote sensing data is included as appendices. And then the other part of it is a template where the community can fill in information about how they would want this information to be shared with stakeholders or with the government or put out into the media to kind of denounce what's happening and bring visibility to what's going on in their lands. So yeah, this is kind of an integrated flow that we're working on at the moment. It's being used by the Wayana community, and we've created resources to be able for them to share with their leadership. So this is a photo of a traditional leader from the Wayana community, kind of getting to explore the dashboard and making sense of it and seeing how it can be used. And it also, we're using the dashboard for them to centralize a lot of their resources that are important for kind of data sovereignty and data rights. So they also have a consultation protocol that they've created, which is also accessible here as a resource for them to be able to share with outside parties when they come into their territory. These are the ways in which we want to be worked with and consulted, and basically how you can conduct free, prior, informed consent when working with us as a community. There's also a guide on the Earth Defenders Toolkit about this work. So I'm gonna, I think, stop there. We are working with a few other communities in the Solomons, which have also used, and I'll just briefly show that, this kind of alerts workflow, and they have actually managed to collect quite a bit of data in Mapeo that they are now using to basically share with the government to as an indicator of what's going on in their lands in regards to logging. So that's been really exciting. And a few weeks ago, I actually just came back from a workshop in Brazil, in the Tumucumaque region, where they are including this toolkit as part of their, what's called in Brazil, PGTA, which is a plan for territorial management, which happens every year, that they evaluate, how they are doing in terms of territorial management. So they're using that to collect surveys and visualizing that on this dashboard that I presented and having it as a way where they used to do this on paper. Now they can instantaneously have access to it in a much more readable and legible format. So that was really exciting to see, and I'm happy to talk more about that process. But I'd love to get to the discussion. So I just want to leave folks with a question that I pondered a lot, and I would love to get other folks thinking about this too. So the Haudenosaunee community in Turtle Island, North America, have this 7th generation principle, right? Which is kind of, how are my actions today going to affect people 7 generations from now? Which I think is just a wonderful framing for anything, but we've been trying to think about this in terms of data sovereignty. So in terms of data, 7 generations from now, how are people going to have access to this? Who should have access to it? And what might that journey look like is something that we're actively thinking through as we're building this out. And so I just wanted to leave that as a final closing reflection before going into the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rudo. Wow, so many questions have come up. Thank you, Alia. Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Rudo. What an amazing set of presentations. I'd like to open the floor to questions. So if anyone has a burning question they'd like to ask, please go ahead. Otherwise, I will launch in with my burning questions. Okay, I think I'll start. So one of my first questions is, do you have any experience of using AI, any of you? And because we said we'd talk about AI, and I'd like to bring AI into the conversation because it is, it's everywhere, and it's a big deal, and lots of people are worried about it, and we are just wondering what the challenges and opportunities might be of using AI in the context of supporting communities to conserve and protect their lands.
I'm happy to share a few things. I don't directly work with AI, but there's a lot of AI adjacent content that we're working with. And one of those is in Earth observation. And that's now kind of an emerging field where when it comes to detecting changes that are happening in the landscape, there's now tools that are kind of coming onto the market, some of which are kind of open source kind of models where you can actually define, and there's even user interfaces being created for this, what the changes that you're interested in, and then the foundation model can then produce other things that look like it. So let's say you're interested in gold mining, you can define a gold mining area that you're familiar with, and then set up a model to continue to look for those gold mining areas now and into the future. And those are the kind of things that we're interested in then serving to communities so they have direct access to it. I think that's really promising. There's also a lot of risks involved in it in terms of a lot of these models are interested in getting data back from the ground. And so there's this kind of feedback loop where some of the community's own data can then end up in the hands of these producers of these foundation models. And there's questions there around data sovereignty, right? And I think it's also interesting to think about the models themselves as where they're being hosted and if they're open or not. There's some that are open and you could then use yourself, but there's others that are consuming your data as a large language model or foundation model. So is it a really good thing if your data is going to help, you know, I'm just going to name OpenAI, for example, like they're taking your data to improve their models. And I think there's like risks and limitations to that when it comes to questions of data sovereignty. Those are the direct ways in which we work with it. So we are working with some kind of algorithms that are on Google Earth Engine, and we're looking at a different tool that just came out called Earth Index, which is producing change detection. But there's lots of other stuff out there that I'm sort of familiar with. Like there's an AI project for revitalizing indigenous language, which I think is really interesting. There's a researcher called Michael Runningwolf who's working on that. And the idea there is like, can AI help us make sense of processing all of the available written text in a language that is now in the process of potentially being out of use, endangered? And can we create tools for young people to be able to practice the language with something that has been generated by AI? So I'm not super familiar with it. I just know that it's out there and that it's interesting, and it's obviously something to watch.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Yeah, Alia, go ahead.
I just add a tiny bit. So I don't work with AI much at all, but one of the members of our team is really, really keen on it because he thinks it can just make so many things more accessible to very low tech users and really simple things. So he's using it to, he wants to develop a little tool, a kind of online tool where communities, for example, could just talk to prompts, and it would enable them to fill in funding applications, these like ridiculous funding applications that you have to fill in with all the log models and the outcomes and the, you know, all of that. And it's just through kind of gathering people's thoughts, enable them to sort of fill in applications more easily. Also generating comms products, so blog posts and reports and things like that more easily for people who are not used to kind of sitting down and writing structured things. And he's also, so he's based in Brazil. And is looking at getting indigenous languages kind of recognizable through on like ChatGPT and other things to make the transcription possibilities more. So yeah, that's all I've got to add to what we did.
Thank you. That's an amazing tool for writing funding applications. It really democratizes a lot of processes that are held in elite hands at the moment. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there. Jonathan, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Sure. No, great. Really enjoyed those presentations. You know, and good to see a lot of the thinking behind not just the technology, but the inclusive approach. You know, there's a lot of conservation technology out there on these days. You know, and a lot of solutions have achieved incredible scale. You know, we estimate that it's kind of $100 million+ a year going into conservation technology, and that's great at one level. But there's also a lot of duplication and a lot of reinventing wheels. And you know, ideally, you know, if solutions are being built to help people monitor wildlife or manage resources, we try to do it as a community in a way that you know doesn't duplicate those resources. You know, with that in mind, and understanding, you know, that a lot of the tools we saw today have been built because maybe other more scale tools haven't met the needs the needs to make them really inclusive. What do you think needs to happen to make sure that one, it's not just a set of tools that are inclusive, but all tools are inclusive, and two, we do that in a way that we're not all duplicating our investments? Tough question. If you had the answer, it's great.
I'll just like mention some thoughts. They might not be very cohesive. Let's see. I mean, a really, really important question. Our background, our background is kind of a rights-based approach rather than like primarily a conservation approach. Like one of our values is recognizing that the two are very much hand in hand, but kind of recognizing that the people on land who've lived there for generations are, you know, in almost all cases, the best custodians. And so trying to find and build tools that that meet their needs. And I think often we found, you know, I don't know who I'm talking to here, like in general, but often we found that conservation organizations, they say a lot of the right things about working with Indigenous peoples and centering them in dialogues. And then we go to these big conferences and there's very little Indigenous presence. There's very, you know, they don't have a voice in those spaces. So in terms of what needs to be done, I think a lot of conservation organizations just need to like walk their talk a lot more in this sense, and probably look at the values which are behind the, you know, this 100 million USD that are going into tech. Like really, what are the values going behind it? And where is the data going, and who is it primarily supposed to be serving? And I think a lot more can be done, and I agree that, you know, to achieve what we need to achieve, to like there has to be more people working together on this. But I think there's a lot of rhetoric and not so much putting into practice that I see, unfortunately. But it's also not my field particularly. Rudo, Phoebe, do you want to add anything there?
Okay, I think I can jump in to add that. Okay, first of all, that is a very crucial question. And speaking from a community perspective, I think it is very important for all this set now to be inclusive. I think it is very important to spend a lot of time in understanding the needs of the communities, because you find that these technologies, yes, are developed by people who are advanced in terms of learning skills and all that, but the users of these technologies are normally at the grassroots level, and I think that is where the problem comes in. The technologies are just developed without considering the needs of these, let's say, the elders who have not gone to school, but are very knowledgeable in terms of traditional knowledge on how to conserve environment traditionally, and that is not considered. So for me, to ensure that all these sets are inclusive and not just all set is not a single set is inclusive, just ensure that these funds reach at the grassroots level, let the process start at the grassroots level, rather than the way earlier said, not going to maybe a big learning institution or conferences and putting this tech into actions and then now taking them to the community. That is now where we come in and assess the tools and see which one fits best our needs. Yeah, thank you. Maybe Rudo.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of thoughts. One, as I mentioned, we've been looking a little bit at biodiversity tooling recently with camera traps, and my organization actually also does a lot of work with bioacoustics, and some of the community partners that we're working with are interested in using those tools. So we recently did an evaluation of all of the available, that we know of, camera trap software that's out there. If you're not familiar with a camera trap, it's a device that you can put on a tree and it takes pictures of any kind of movement nearby. So it's a very popular kind of visual, you know, tool for documenting photos and videos of animals and, you know, terrestrial kind of creatures walking around. And we looked at all the available software and kind of evaluated in relation to who we know the community partners are and their level of expertise and some of their requirements, which we've been talking about, right? Like, so data sovereignty, but also accessibility. And we found that there were only 1 or 2 out of 50 that were even close to approximating, you know, the needs that communities have on the ground, as Phoebe was saying. So I think there's a lot more to be done around just really making sure that we're building software that is responding to the needs of communities and that can be directly used by them and not by researchers. So a lot of available off-the-shelf stuff does not prioritize community usage primarily, right? It's more built for other people and then kind of applied after the fact once it's been designed. And that was my experience with a tool like ArcGIS in the GIS space as well, much like Alia mentioned. is that we found ourselves just struggling to create training materials for a tool that is just way too advanced and powerful to be used for the specific use case of working with communities that don't have that same kind of baseline of technical training, right? So I think that's one thought, is there's more work to be done despite all the millions of dollars of investment. It's still not being invested in the right way, I think. And I think all of us are saying that for community use cases. The other thought that I had just listening to your question, Jonathan, is like part of what we're building is kind of predicated on what you're mentioning, that there's all of these existing tools and data that's out there. And I come from the kind of mapping and monitoring background, and I've seen that across different communities and geographies and continents, that there's different tools being used everywhere, and it can be overwhelming and confusing knowing which tools to use. And there's existing data from different past experiences, right? And so part of what we're building is at least hoping to solve a little bit of that, of just consolidating all of the data from these different tools in one place, so that at least it's not sitting in each different software that's being used by a different, with a different NGO, or, you know, somebody that's come in to do kind of a data collection project with the community. So at least we're hoping to help with that access problem, because what's often happened is that communities are alienated from their data, right? Because it's sitting in these complex tools that they don't have access to, or it's online somewhere, right? And that's a problem. So we're at least hoping to maybe solve that a little bit with what we're building right now.
Thank you so much for your question, Jonathan, and for your responses. Does anyone have another question? Otherwise, I'll go ahead with some of mine. Well, one of my questions really is about environmental impact, because I didn't even know that this much software existed, and then I can't imagine the level of storage that is required, especially if you're trying to store data that is going to last a long time. And I saw one question in the chat, which I guess this is a two-part question, because one question in the chat is, how long does it last in servers? And I remember a quote from Tyson Yunkaporta, who's an Aboriginal Australian philosopher, comes to mind, which he said, the best data storage is the community, you know, or is people's brains, because everything else is temporary. And I don't know what level of technology advancement there is now in terms of the degradation of these big servers, and of, you know, the actual machines that hold the data. So that's one. And the energy required to run these, hold them, run all the you know, machines, and I just was wondering if you could speak a bit to that, because I don't know any of the data around that. I don't know how much it takes. I don't know how much it consumes. But, you know, you do hear sort of that, you know, the energy consumption of servers is as an astounding figures, you know, that you can't even compute. So I'd just like to understand how you balance that with the work you're doing. And also this question of how long can it last in the servers and the storage facilities.
No one wants to answer this question. I mean, how long can it last? You know, I'm actually definitely the wrong person to answer this question. I'm not a technologist. I'm the sort of the other side of our work team. I just wanted to say one thing. I mean, I agree that what you mentioned, Emily, that the sort of only lasting storage is the community. We worked with a community in Guyana a few years back, and they had done this amazing mapping work, including interviews, like all these interviews. They'd collected so much information about the ancestral land use, and they'd collected it all, and they had sort of hundreds, like literally hundreds of notebooks, because that's what they were using at the time. This was probably like 12 or more years ago. And then by the time that you know, my colleague went to work with them, you know, most of those notebooks had been eaten by rats, stored in a shed and eaten by rats. And at that point, they started putting what they could to kind of into a computer, thinking this is kind of going to be better data storage. But then it was put into a computer that, you know, only then one person had the ability to actually read that information in the computer program. And I don't know where it is now. It wasn't a community I was directly working in. But it's a huge issue. I want to say that it's a really big question. It's a really big issue. And I think another thing also to consider particularly when we're talking about map making and ancestral knowledge, is that, maps, communities' land and communities' territory is alive. When you create a map and create a sort of static digital image of something, it's static. It kind of dies in a way. And so there's also that to consider. There are ways of sort of combating that. I think the terror stories idea is, does make things more alive. It kind of gives voices, and you can update things. But I think that's just another important thing to consider, that having a map of your land isn't the same as passing information on intergenerationally. And then in terms of the environmental impact, I mean, some of the data that we're talking about isn't stored on big servers, and I think the environmental impact wasn't the sort of primary reason for that. It was more to do with local data sovereignty and kind of keeping everything local. But there's still all of the heavy metals and precious metals in mobile phones that are used, and all of that. I haven't got anything positive to say about that, except imbalance in the world. The amount of resources used for good versus the ones on the other side, it's probably a drop.
Couple of thoughts to add. A lot of the communities that I've worked with would entirely agree with that notion that communities are and have been the primary source of knowledge. We talk a lot of disruption to that process, right? That unfortunately there's been a lot of loss of that knowledge because of various reasons, different dynamics that are ongoing. A lot of knowledge with the communities is transmitted orally, and for various reasons, younger people have not been around to absorb that knowledge because they've been traveling to different sites for work, or moved to the city, or there's other kinds of sort of pressures of modernity that have been emerging. And so that's one dynamic where digital tools can be helpful for preserving some of that knowledge, and hopefully having it be available as a resource for the communities, as sort of the current generation of elders is passing along. And you don't have that sort of repository of knowledge being stored in people's minds, that there's at least a way to ensure that people have access to it now and into the future, right? 200 years from now, there's still some kind of record of oral histories, for example, via terror stories or via a different tool that can be accessible to community members so that they can continue to have that knowledge and as a resource for them. I recently came back from the Solomon Islands, where there were some really interesting reflections about the importance of kind of digital systems for data sovereignty. And this kind of relates also to what Alia was saying. So there, as the Solomon Islands is in the Pacific, they have a issue where there's often cyclones that are coming in over their island and kind of wiping everything away. So they've done data collection before in paper format, or even having local computers. And then a cyclone comes in and basically everything gets destroyed. So for them, having kind of resilient systems that are actually in the cloud, to them is a way to have data sovereignty, even though it's not stored locally, because it's a way for them to keep it into some kind of perpetuity, even though there's server costs and all of the things that you mentioned. But it's a better way than keeping things locally, because paper gets destroyed, it gets wet, and local systems are fragile in that sense. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of counterpoint to the sort of keep things local perspective. The other thing I wanted to say is I definitely agree with Alia that it's sort of a drop in the bucket in terms of the cost that it takes to host servers to hold some community data, compared to the tremendous amount of compute that it takes to train a large language model, for example, or to process big data, or the majority of ways in which data is being circulated on the internet today. If we were to actually compute that, quantitatively, it would be an infinitesimally small amount of energy required to use the systems that we do. And I also think there's a sense in which I think to the notion of counter mapping, from the kind of participatory mapping movement, that we're using tools that were developed in the West. So a map was historically a product of kind of colonialism and sort of a Western way of viewing the world, which is not always commensurate with indigenous knowledge systems, but it's still important to do because it's a way of having power and fighting back against those systems, right? And asserting yourself via your own map. And I think of the same way in terms of the digital systems that we're now building, is it's using some of that, technology and it could be potentially having an environmental impact, but it's still important to do because it's enabling us to have power and for communities to have access to data that is theirs and that they can control and use to advance their rights in the way that we've been mentioning. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Rudo. And I guess a thought that comes to mind, which maybe Phoebe can respond to, is all of this new technology is something that is easily adopted by the youth in the community. So presumably, and as you said earlier, part of the richness of this is the process. It's getting the community together around a collective objective to defend their land and protect their knowledge. And so presumably there's also a benefit to using technology that can bring the youth into dialogue with their elders and generate some of that non-digital intergenerational knowledge transfer through just an actual tool of having a technology. This is just a reflection, thinking about what you've just said. Is that true, Phoebe?
Yes, it is true. And reflecting back when we began the mapping, you find that youths are know how to use like phones and smartphones and in the laptops, but in reality they don't know how to use. They don't have enough knowledge on what is supposed to be stored using those phones, and that one brings us to now what we all observed. Entire team when we are doing the mapping process as a takeaway home is that there was a massive intergenerational transmission of indigenous knowledge throughout the process, because you find that youth adopted easily on how to use technology in all this process, but in the process they learned a lot from the elders on how even like simple things like where the grazing zones are, or rather how what plants or trees are medicinal, like such aspects. So when we were doing the evaluation at the end of the mapping process, like everyone, like every youth who participated in the mapping, say that it's a privilege, including myself, because I am a youth and I come from Ogie community, and if I am rated now, if based on how I understand the land, like the historical injustices and all the story of Ogie people, rating from 2020 to now, I can say that I'm in a better place, not because of technology, but because of what the elders shared with us. So yeah, so and that one again brings me to conclude that the aspect of using technology and mapping is not just those ones who have gone to school. It is interconnectedness of different bodies, and to achieve a perfect use of technologies and to produce the best outputs, you need even the youngest ones in the community, like the children. So it is something that we need to appreciate and ensure that we incorporate them in every stage we do in using technologies in our communities, yeah, including those who develop technologies. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. That's really, really fascinating. I'm doing a lot of talking. I'm aware that technology isn't necessarily an easy language for people working in conservation or in community-based conservation, which is why we're having this session. But I really would like to field some questions from the audience here, from the participants. There are 35 of you. So do we have any questions? Otherwise, I can carry on asking them if you like my questions, but I would love to hear from someone else. Well, maybe I'll carry on asking questions then. Great. Please do not hesitate. Oh, Manish, thank you. We have a question. Technologies often rely on historical data and trends, and how do you ensure this technology incorporates enough opportunity for innovation and creative solutions?
Happy to speak a little bit to that. Yeah, I think that's sort of one of the things we're grappling with, and one of the difficulties of working with technology is that there's always something new on the horizon, right? And something exciting and potentially a new tool that may emerge that gets built that people want to use, right? And then how do you deal with that when it comes to like long-term data sovereignty and data storage? So a lot of the work that we're doing is more on the kind of back end in terms of data storage to basically put things into formats that are going to persist in the very long term, right? So avoiding any kind of proprietary data storage solution or type of format where you're kind of locked into one tool, but ensuring that, 100, 200 years from now, somebody will be able to use that data in whatever the technology that exists at that point in the future, right? So that you're not, again, siloed or stuck into any one system. That's something we found with some of the proprietary solutions, is that they have their own ways of storing data, which means that you can only use that data with their specific solution, which comes at a cost, right? So I think one of the things we're all trying to avoid as technologists is building things that have that same structure. So what we're trying to do is getting data from all of these different places and storing it in a consistent way where, as new kind of creative ways of visualizing data come into the fore, for example, that those tools will be able to use the data kind of in the long term, so that communities are not stuck with the current tools of today, but can in the future use anything that is sort of emergent.
Thank you so much, Rido. Phoebe, do you want to
Yes.
say?
Yes, also I can say that the aspect of feeding the technology, the information that is used to feed the technology is innovation and creativity in its own perspective. Looking at it, technology cannot be complete without some information, and based on the needs, like for example, if Awana is targeting a community, for it to complete its tech tools, it has to get information from Ogiek. So, and maybe it has to translate it into Ogiek language, and I believe that is the best way to allow innovation and creativity to take its space when developing technologies. Yeah,
I would just like really emphasize what Phoebe said, and say that we've learned so much. I mean, most of what we're learning in terms of the development comes from the communities that we're co-designing the tools with. And in many cases, we're stuck in our mindset of like, we've used computers, or I've used computers like 30 plus years. I've had a smartphone since they came out. My mind has been built by the technology which has been around, whereas many of the community members that we run UX and UI workshops with, so design workshops with, are encountering some of these technologies for the first time or only very recently. So they're not molded by in the same way that our tech team has been molded, and they often come up with like really insightful and different approaches and questions about ways to do things. I'm just trying to think of an example, and the only one I can think of is super mundane and not a very good example of this at all, but just like, for example, the buttons that you need to press to like type or to like make it go backwards and forwards. The communities in the Amazon, they were like, these buttons are far too small. We have hunter-gatherer hands. We've got big fingers. We need bigger buttons because this like tiny keyboard is like not working for us. That's a really like crude example. But there have been lots of like very important things fed to us by like during the workshops, which have really kind of shifted our thinking as a team and made sure that the tool does stay, like, hopefully stays relevant and open to innovation.
Thanks so much. I love that, that there's that interactivity. So we've got two questions in the chat, one from Arjun. So one of the difficulties we face in working with conservation technology is generating funds for piloting, even though the work is promising and urgent. Especially if you aren't from a research organizations, donors don't trust your work. What is your experience piloting getting funds to pilot technological solutions?
Mixed. I would say from our side, and I suspect Ali would agree with this, there's not enough donors that understand the value of the kind of co-creating work that we're doing with technology, and the investment that may be required into kind of building technology to ensure that we're meeting the goals of community partners in the long term, right? But I think there are some foundations that are now starting to recognize that, with the importance of investing also into some of the tools that communities are using, right? So in the climate space, there's now an increasing commitment to, in philanthropy to give to communities directly, right, rather than kind of intermediary organizations like NGOs. And that's been really great, and kind of there's still more that needs to be done in that regard, but it's a promising kind of direction for philanthropy to go in. And I think to accompany that, there's still sort of a need in investment in the kind of intermediary work, like, for example, the tool building that the communities are using to accomplish their goals. And there's some donors that are starting to recognize that, and that's been really great. And one example is Niatero, who we work with closely, who has been increasingly sort of recognizing the need to also fund some of the technology work that is being co-created with communities. But I think still a lot more needs to be done, right? And most of the funding still tends to go towards research organizations or kind of bigger entities that are not as deeply steeped and grounded in the realities of communities. So I think more needs to be done, but there's starting to be some recognition amongst philanthropy that that's important.
Thank you, Rudo. And I'd just like to inform everyone that the Darwin Initiative in the UK that is open to organizations from all over the global south has a new, well, for the past few years, has a new grant scheme called the Innovation Grants, which are opportunities for piloting innovations, including technological innovations. And the Darwin Initiative round 31 just opened a few weeks ago. And by the way, GDF is running a series on how to write good Darwin Initiative proposals. So if you're curious and want to be part of an online series learning how to write Darwin Initiative proposals, and you have a technological innovation that you'd like to pilot, get in touch. Now, I have two other questions that have come up in the chat. One is a long question by Diane. Diane, would you prefer me to speak it? I might just summarize that. Diane notes a lot of trade-offs in ensuring that technology is inclusive and ethical, trade-offs in AI, and the importance of data sovereignty and the value of getting data backed up by the cloud. She says, what other trade-offs do we need to work through in building solutions for communities to ensure we maximize the value of the limited resources we all have? So what trade-offs are we working through? You can see the longer question in the chat. I've summarized it a bit.
One thing that comes to mind, because I've just recently read a couple of articles about it, is just the internet itself. So I think I mentioned that when I first began working in the Amazon, there was no internet available in any of the communities, like outside of Lima, outside of the major cities. It was almost impossible to find. And now, communities across Brazil, everyone's got Starlink, everyone pretty much. And it's a huge impact. It's happened so quickly, like within the last year, 18 months. And it's something that, we've heard from communities talking about, we need this because we need to get alerts out. We need to be able to inform people about the illegal mining, or if there's a health emergency, like we need this. But, immediately, this was just from an article I was reading yesterday, you go to a village meeting and everyone's kind of scrolling through their phones and not actually listening and engaging with the meeting anymore. I think, we're very interested in looking for a way to support communities to, develop protocols and think about what's best practice for kind of using internet in a community. We definitely don't want to, advise people against it, but just to kind of think about some of the issues which, we're grappling with them in this country, in the UK. I'm based in the UK. All of the things about security of youth, access to pornography, access to all of these things, and health impacts for young people, like addiction, screen addiction, as well as just the kind of loss of interaction that happens when people start staring at their screen, which I'm sure many of us are aware of. So we haven't figured it out in the UK. Maybe some of these communities can get ahead of us in that sense. And I think some of them have got ideas, only having it switched on for certain amounts of time. But I think that's a big thing that's, we need to address globally, but I think it's happening now in some of these communities.
Yeah, I saw that headline as well. Astounding. Not astounding, because that's what you know, social media, and the algorithm is there to keep you hooked all day long, and we all know this. But yeah, something needs to be done for everyone, I'd say, about that particular question, and not just Indigenous communities who are encountering the internet for the first time. Sharma asked.
Okay, sorry, before you proceed, I think
Yes.
also it's important also to recognize the biocultural protocols existing in the community and legalize them to ensure that there is a safety in how to use or access data from communities. You find that there is a okay, at the end of it all, we have to be selfish as communities in what is supposed to be consumed and what is not supposed to be consumed. If it is something that can be used against the community, or can be used, someone can use advantage of the community, it is good to recognize the governing structures that exist that clearly states there are. I know most of the communities, especially in Kenya, have the biocultural protocols, and that one states clearly how to even access the community. As a researcher, maybe if you want to come and do your research in the community, you have to go through several protocols for you to be allowed. You cannot just walk into any community, or rather go and publish or use technology to showcase information about communities. So it starts from all of us as researchers, as tech developers, and as communities, to ensure that we respect the knowledge that comes from the community, and that one will just flow to other people. So it has to be ambassadors to ensure that we don't consume information from communities without their consent. So I think it is important to also be self-driven when doing all this.
Thank you, Phoebe. And I think that ties into the question from Kasosi, which is, how can we ensure that the implementation of digital technologies in community-based conservation efforts respects and preserves Indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage, whilst also preventing data extraction and exploitation? And presumably what you're talking about is these community-based protocols as one of the means for preventing that. Does anyone have any other examples of how that is done in communities, preventing data extraction and exploitation whilst preserving Indigenous knowledge? I think you've spoken to a little bit in your presentations, but maybe you can just summarize it for briefly.
I mean, I think for anyone, so, you know, we work with communities where we've been invited to work, kind of supporting like very, very local, very grassroots initiatives. I think in many cases it's, you know, NGOs and others sort of working with communities and finding ways to make sure that their work doesn't like involve extraction and exploitation. I think there are some really good principles behind the participatory methodologies if they're like properly founded in community values. The Wayana, who Rudo mentioned, they have a protocol for how to consult them, how to sort of carry out proper epic process with them, which is fascinating. And I think like lots of people can learn from. So, you know, if someone wants to work with them, they're like, you know, do it like this. We're not just going to show up to your meeting, like do it like this, which they developed because of like bad experience with you know, conservation and other organizations in the past. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
Yeah, to summarize, I can say that there's kind of a technology side to it, in terms of like the tools that we're building and others that exist, like uphold, which Alia mentioned, that are really kind of steeped in those principles of data sovereignty as a way to ensure that you avoid that kind of extraction, because sometimes the technology is built in such a way where it needs to be stored outside of your own control, or an NGO or researcher or whoever needs to be involved in doing that. So there's a technology side to it, and I think what we're trying to do as technology builders is really co-creating with, you know, community partners like Phoebe's community, and many others, the Wayana, to ensure that we're building it in such a way that the communities will always have access from the technology side. But there's absolutely, and I think Phoebe and Alia both mentioned this other side of, you know, working with local partners or organizations that themselves respect those protocols, right? So we as Conservation Metrics, we primarily only work with the kind of indigenous organizations that, you know, respond to and are responsible to the traditional leadership, for example, instead of an outside NGO that happens to work with the community. We found more value in directly working with the community themselves, as making sure that we're building in such a way that, that we're respecting those principles, and also that they themselves, as they are doing implementation, are very closely responding to the needs of community and making sure that while they're documenting indigenous knowledge and things like that, that it's actually in the hands of the community rather than, you know, being stored somewhere else.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, will you go quickly, and then we'll have to close because I think some people have to go off to other meetings.
Okay, I didn't realize time was up. Yeah, I'll be super quick, and I'll just put a question out there, and if we don't have time for responses, that's fine. You know, one thing we're kind of struggling with across all the different technologies out there is building strong communities of practice. And I think everything I've kind of heard on today, what you're all aspiring to, is you're really only going to achieve your goals if these efforts aren't led by the organizations, but they're led by a strong group, a strong community of practice from the communities who you're all working to support. You know, and for me, the best solution in the long term is not only a strong community of practice that is dedicated to local communities, but is dedicated to everyone working in this space. You know, within conservation, you know, we have fragmented communities of practice. It would be great if there was a strong community of practice that covers both the technologies and tools you're working in here, but also one where the voice of the communities you work with was as strong as, or you know, or stronger than, or was as strong at least as the voice of, say, governments managing protected areas. How do we get to that really strong community of practice where we know we've got the people on the ground leading with their needs?
I mean, maybe we need to start, one way of starting is just starting more amongst ourselves. So, I mean, I feel like we've been like in a little bit of, I maybe have been in a little bit of a tunnel with the whole development of Map.io over the last few years. You know, Rudo is kind of bringing us like in with all of the Guardian connected tools. And we've now got the Earth Defenders Toolkit where we're trying to kind of bring lots of things together. We have, we've had some of, we've definitely spoken to people at other development organizations, but maybe we should do something a little bit more organized and like not formal, but just like a bit more systematic amongst ourselves as, people developing tech who can like bring in the community voices as well, and build strong relationships between us. And then, yeah, I agree. getting on an equal plane as the people with the real power is like a different question. But maybe we need to start. Maybe we should have another chat, Jonathan, with more people involved.
Thank you so much, Alia. Thank you, Jonathan, for your question. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it a day because it is 2 minutes past our time. And I'd like to really thank you so much, Alia, Phoebe, and Rudo. It was completely enlightening for me. I think I knew little to nothing about all of this. I was just curious. And now I feel really, thank you so much. It's been really brilliant to talk. And I'd just like to remind everyone that the third session of this series, Conservation's Leading Edges, is happening on the 28th of June. And it's about restoring environments through seed banks and plant nurseries. So quite a different sphere we're moving to in 3 weeks. Thank you everyone so much. Thank you for your questions. This will be recorded and put up online, so you'll be able to view it again and share it. Wishing you all a wonderful day, a wonderful evening, a wonderful weekend. And thank you again to our speakers. It's been really, really a fascinating encounter. Bye now.